Harbor Officer Rachel Bennett thought she understood danger until betrayal wore a badge she trusted. Beaten, gagged, and bound to the helm of her own patrol boat, she was sent sinking into the winter Atlantic, meant to vanish with the evidence of a horrific trafficking route hidden behind medical shipments. The storm agreed. The sea didn't care. The world looked away. But fate wasn't finished. Out on the black water, a rescue diver who swore he was done saving anyone turned back because a German shepherd with scars and steel in his eyes heard the call first. Against the wind, against the cold, against death itself. Before we begin, if this story touches your heart, comment Amen and subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet heroes. The Gulf of Maine lay hammered by winter wind like knotted rope, snow like salt, and black water shouldering ice against the docks as if the sea were trying to climb onto land. Harbor Officer Rachel Bennett watched the radar glow paint her cheekbones a sickly green while the station's windows trembled in their frames. She was 32, tall in a practical way, built for long nights and heavier choices, her shoulders narrow but steady, her stance the kind that didn't waste motion. Her hair, a dark blonde that the sea air had lightened in stubborn streaks, was pulled into a low bun that always came undone the moment a storm decided to be personal. Freckles dusted her nose like old constellations, and her eyes were a clear gray-green, the color of sea glass that had survived being smashed and still found a way to shine. Rachel didn't smile often at work, not because she didn't have humor, but because she'd learned that people used smiles as permission to lie. Still, when she did smile, it arrived crooked and quick, usually after she dropped a dry one-liner that made the rookies laugh and the veterans groan like the punchline had punched them back. She was known for being methodical and too calm, the kind of calm that came from a past event that wouldn't stop echoing. 10 years earlier, her older brother had disappeared during a winter squall off Matinicus, a fishing skiff found later without him, the ocean offering only a blank receipt. It didn't make Rachel fearful of water, it made her furious at what water could hide. She'd joined harbor enforcement because the sea loved secrets, and she refused to let it keep them all. Tonight, her refusal had numbers. On the AIS screen, a chain of fishing vessels blinked in and out of existence along a corridor that didn't match ordinary routes. They didn't drift as if signals were lost to weather. They vanished like someone had pressed a mute button, then returned hours later with their tracks stitched back in place, too neat to be real, like footprints in fresh snow that somehow avoided every crack and puddle. Rachel's gloved finger traced the ghost gaps. She wasn't religious in the church sense, but she'd spent enough time on night watch to believe in older gods, probability, pattern, consequence. The first two were talking. "You seeing this?" she asked without turning. At the back desk, Evan Price, the station's comms and systems tech, spun slowly in his chair. 27, slim, pale in that indoor way, with dark curls that refused to be tamed and glasses that always slid down his nose when he got nervous. He had the gentle temperament of someone who apologized to furniture after bumping into it, but his mind was sharp as a hook, quiet, precise, and easily bruised by loud opinions. "I'm seeing it," he said, voice cautious, like the sea might hear through the wiring. "But storms mess with the feed, multipath reflections, antenna icing, bad relays." Rachel lifted a hand. "I know what a storm does," she said. "This isn't weather. This is choreography." Evan swallowed and rolled closer, tapping keys. The playback confirmed her gut, the same corridor, the same timing, the same unnatural, clean reappearance. He tried to joke, because Evan tried to make fear smaller by turning it into something that fit inside a sentence. "Maybe the boats are shy," he offered weakly. Rachel's mouth twitched. "If they're shy, they're also punctual, which makes them rude." Her humor didn't soften the truth. It just made it bearable to hold. Evan kept digging, pulling metadata, signal strength anomalies, timestamps that aligned too perfectly with known patrol shift changes. Rachel opened a worn notebook, the one she carried like a talisman, pages crammed with tide times, vessel names, and the kind of details most people didn't notice because noticing was exhausting. She wrote, "Disappear, reappear corridor, east of Whitecap Ledge, always between 23:10 to 2:40. Then she underlined it hard enough the pen almost tore paper. The radio crackled with a routine call from a tug, and outside, a buoy bell rang in the gale like a distant, irritated prayer. The station smelled of wet wool and burnt coffee. Rachel's stomach tightened, not hunger, not sickness, but that sense of standing at the edge of something that would change shape the moment she stepped closer. She'd felt it before on cases that looked ordinary until they weren't. A stolen outboard that turned into an arson ring, a missing teen that turned into a fraud scheme with teeth. The sea didn't do small, not for long. She had the memory card in her pocket, and it felt heavier than plastic had any right to be. She'd received it 2 days earlier in a plain envelope left in her locker without a name, just a smear of salt across the flap like a fingerprint from the ocean itself. Inside were screenshots of AIS logs, photographs taken in dim light of a freezer hold industrial insulation, metal racks, and something that made Rachel's throat clamp tight. The edge of a sneaker, small, child-sized, half obscured under a tarp. Whoever had taken the photos had tried to keep their hands steady, and you could tell they'd failed because fear shook the frame. There was also a list of missing persons, local and out of state, names that looked normal until you stared long enough and realized normal was the disguise. Young women, a man with a medical bracelet, a teenage boy last seen near a bus station. The connecting thread wasn't obvious until Rachel matched dates with the medical shipments she'd seen in port paperwork. Refrigerated containers cleared as supplies, sealed, rushed through after hours, always signed off by someone who didn't like questions. Medical shipments were supposed to mean medicine. But the photos didn't look like medicine, they looked like storage, like hiding, like the kind of cold meant to keep something quiet. Rachel hadn't told anyone about the card at first, not even Sarah Monroe, because trust was a currency Rachel spent carefully, and the storm outside made everyone feel closer than they really were. Sarah Monroe was the harbor master and Rachel's direct supervisor, a woman in her mid-40s with iron-gray hair clipped into a short, no-nonsense cut and skin browned by years of windburn and sun. Sarah carried herself like a lighthouse, steady, plain, and impossible to ignore, and she spoke with the blunt kindness of someone who'd seen what softness could cost. She was also fiercely protective of her people, the kind who'd put herself between a rookie and a lawsuit without even taking a breath. But even Sarah had to answer to politics, to budgets, to men in suits who treated the sea like a spreadsheet. Rachel understood that if her suspicion was wrong, she'd embarrass the station. If she was right, she might get someone killed. That's what made her hand so steady now. She wasn't choosing between good and bad. She was choosing between bad and worse. "Let me run a deeper cross-check," Evan said, eyes fixed on the screen. "Maybe I can pull transponder IDS and see if any match recent refrigerated cargo manifests." Rachel nodded. "Do it." Quietly. Evan hesitated. "Rachel, if someone is spoofing AIS, that's not hobby level." "I know," Rachel said. And because she wasn't cruel, she added, "You can step away if you need to." Evan shook his head, chin lifting a fraction. He'd never be the loud hero, but he had a stubborn spine that only showed up when it mattered. "No," he said. "If you're seeing a pattern, then it's real enough to check." Rachel didn't thank him. She gave him something better, trust in the form of action. She slid another mug of coffee toward him. "Drink. You'll need your brain warm." Evan grimaced and took it anyway, the way people accept medicine when they don't like the taste. Rachel's phone buzzed once, an alert from a port camera feed. The frame showed a service road near a secondary pier, lights blurred by snow. A refrigerated truck had moved through 15 minutes ago, earlier than scheduled, and the gate log showed a manual override. Rachel's pulse didn't spike. It narrowed. Her thoughts sharpened into a single line. They're moving tonight, not later, not soon. Tonight. She finally went to Sarah's office, where the harbor master sat beneath a wall map studded with pins and scribbled notes. Sarah looked up, reading Rachel's face the way sailors read clouds. "Don't tell me you've got another feeling," Sarah said, and tried to sound annoyed, but concern leaked through anyway. Rachel closed the door gently. "Not a feeling," she said. "A track." She laid the memory card on the desk like a coin paid to a ferryman. Sarah's eyes hardened as she listened, scanning the screenshots, the list of names, the AIS gaps. The room went quiet except for the heater rattling like an old man clearing his throat. For a moment, Sarah didn't speak, and Rachel saw something human pass through her supervisor's expression: anger, fear, the old tired grief of someone who'd watched the sea take and take and take. Then Sarah exhaled, slow. "Where did you get this?" Rachel met her gaze. "It showed up." Sarah didn't like mysteries. She liked chains of custody and clean reports, but she also liked truth. "If this is what it looks like," Sarah said carefully, "we don't handle it alone." "I know," Rachel replied. "That's why I'm here. We bring it to the table. Federal, Coast Guard Investigative Service, whoever will actually move." Sarah studied her. "And if whoever's behind this has friends?" Rachel's smile flickered, grim and bright. "Then we pick the table with the fewest roaches." Sarah huffed, half laugh, half sigh. It was the kind of humor you used when the alternative was to start screaming. She tapped the folder on her desk, a routine incident packet, and pushed it aside like it was suddenly irrelevant. "All right," Sarah said. "We do this smart. We do this by procedure. We do this with witnesses and recordings and backups." Rachel nodded, but inside her chest, something ached. Not fear of violence, but fear of loneliness. Because she'd learned the worst part of fighting the sea wasn't the cold. It was the feeling that you could shout and the world would keep walking. Tonight, at least, Sarah had stopped walking. Rachel pocketed the memory card again, along with a second copy Evan had already made on a secure drive. She checked her belt, her gloves, her hood. Sarah's voice followed her as she headed for the door. "Rachel, don't play hero." Rachel paused, hand on the knob. "I'm not," she said. "I'm playing evidence." She stepped back into the storm. Snow slapped her cheeks and melted into the corners of her eyes like the sea trying to read her thoughts. The parking lot lights shimmered in the wind, and beyond the docks, the Atlantic rolled under ice like a giant animal pretending it was asleep. Rachel started her engine, feeling the familiar tremor of responsibility settle over her shoulders. She wasn't marching toward glory. She was carrying a small piece of truth through a night that wanted it drowned. And as she pulled out toward the waterfront, toward the cameras, the logs, the quiet pier where paperwork became reality, she understood the simplest, cruelest lesson winter ever taught. The ocean doesn't need to hate you to kill you. It only needs you to be alone. The wind bullied the harbor lights into halos, turning every snowflake into a brief spark before it died. Rachel Bennett drove with both hands steady on the wheel, but the steadiness wasn't peace. It was discipline, the kind you build when your fear has learned to wear a uniform. The wipers fought ice in tired arcs, and the radio hissed with the soft arrogance of a storm that thought it owned all frequencies. She kept the patrol SUV's cabin dim, dash lights low, so the dark outside couldn't see her thinking. The memory card pressed against her coat like a small, hard secret with teeth. 2 copies existed now, one in her pocket, one locked in Evan Price's encrypted drive back at the station under Sarah Monroe's watch. But Rachel had learned that backup didn't always mean safe. Sometimes backup just meant more things to lose. The secondary pier came into view through curtains of snow. Pier 9 was older than most of the town's grudges, its timbers stained with salt and diesel, its cleats worn smooth by generations of hands that had done honest work and a few that hadn't. Tonight, it looked like a stage built for a bad play. The crane frozen in place like a bent metal arm, the empty stacks of lobster traps like rib cages, the black sea beyond chopping at ice as if it wanted a bite of land. Rachel pulled into the lot and killed her lights, letting the engine idle. She didn't step out yet. She watched. A refrigerated trailer sat near the service gate, white sides flecked with grime, its diesel unit humming, a sound too steady to belong in a storm. The gate arm was raised despite the hour. No security guard in sight. That matched the alert. Manual override. Rachel's mind arranged the facts the way you lay out evidence on a table, flat, clean, unemotional. If someone wanted this moved quietly, they'd pick a night when the weather made witnesses scarce and cameras blurry. If someone wanted it moved quickly, they'd do it early, before scheduled paperwork could catch up. Rachel breathed in and tasted salt even inside the cabin. She thought of Sarah Monroe's warning, "Don't play hero," and felt a grim humor rise like a bubble. Rachel wasn't a hero. Heroes ran toward flames because they believed the fire had meaning. Rachel ran toward paper trails because she believed someone was using procedure as a weapon, and she refused to be cut by bureaucracy in slow motion. She checked her body cam, clicked it on, and sent a silent ping to Sarah's office line. On site at Pier 9. Visual on reefer trailer. No guard. If you don't hear from me in 10, call it in. She didn't like that she had to plan for absence, but she'd learned that storms weren't the only things that made people disappear. When she stepped out, the cold punched hard and immediate, biting her cheeks through the balaclava and curling into her sleeves. Snow squealed under her boots. She moved with that patrol rhythm, deliberate, no wasted gestures, keeping her flashlight beam low and angled, avoiding the instinct to paint everything in bright certainty. Her breath came in white bursts. Halfway across the lot she paused, listening. The reefer unit's hum, the distant bell buoy, a gull crying somewhere like a complaint. Then, faint but clear, another sound. A car engine approaching, tires on slush, careful speed. Rachel's shoulders tightened. She turned slowly as headlights swung into the lot. The vehicle was an unmarked sedan, dark, familiar in the way a shadow can be familiar if it's followed you enough times. It rolled to a stop behind her, and the driver's door opened with unhurried confidence. Detective Mark Halston stepped out as if the storm had invited him personally. He was in his early 40s, medium tall, broad-shouldered, but not bulky, a man built like he'd once played football and then decided thinking was a better weapon. His hair was dark and cut close, the kind of neatness meant to signal control, and stubble shadowed his jaw in a way that looked accidental, but was probably calculated just enough to make him seem human, not enough to make him seem sloppy. Mark's eyes were brown and steady, and when he looked at people, he tended to hold the gaze a beat longer than comfortable, like he was measuring them for hidden pockets. He wore a long navy coat and leather gloves, and he moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years walking into rooms where everyone pretended not to be afraid. Most folks described Mark as professional, which was a polite way of saying he didn't offer warmth unless it served a purpose. Rachel had trusted him anyway, because she'd seen him do good work, painfully careful interviews, tidy evidence handling, real compassion when no one was watching. She'd also seen the origin of his professionalism. 5 years ago, a case he led had collapsed because a rookie botched chain of custody and the suspect walked. A week later, a witness was found dead. Mark Halston had blamed the system out loud, but the way his mouth tightened afterward told Rachel he'd also blamed himself. Since then, he'd become the kind of man who treated procedure like gospel. Procedure was supposed to protect people. Rachel had admired that. Tonight his presence felt like a lock clicking shut. "Rachel," Mark called over the wind, voice warm enough to pass as concern. "This is a hell of a night to be sightseeing." Rachel kept her hands visible, her posture relaxed but braced. "It's a hell of a night for anyone to be here," she replied. "Including you." Mark smiled faintly, the expression he used when he wanted the other person to feel like they were still friends. "I got a ping from one of the port systems," he said, nodding toward the reefer trailer. "After-hours movement. Thought I'd swing by before it turns into paperwork." He walked a few steps closer, boots crunching, careful to stop at a distance that looked respectful. His breath fogged between them. "Sarah knows you're out here?" Rachel heard the name as a test. She didn't answer directly. Why would a detective from inland care about a port trailer at midnight? Mark's smile didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Because you care," he said. And you're not the type to chase a ghost unless it's wearing a name tag." He tilted his head, studying her the way he studied suspects. "You look like you haven't slept." Rachel gave him the smallest laugh. "Neither do criminals." Mark let that sit, then gestured gently toward her coat pocket without quite pointing. "So," he said, voice still mild, "what are you carrying?" The question landed with a weight that made Rachel's stomach drop, not because it was accusatory, but because it was precise. The wrong question, asked at the wrong time, by the right person. Rachel's mind flashed through possibilities like a lighthouse beam. He'd heard something. He'd guessed. He'd been told. Maybe it was a coincidence. But Rachel's instincts, honed by years of watching men lie with relaxed shoulders, felt the shift beneath his words. The storm didn't bother pretending. It howled harder. "Just my notes," Rachel said lightly, "and the world's worst hand warmers." Mark chuckled, a polite sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny," he said, "because you're not usually sentimental about notes." He stepped one pace closer, and Rachel noticed the tiny detail that made her heart go colder than the air. Mark's right glove was slightly damp near the wrist, as if he'd recently handled something wet like a door latch iced over, or a piece of equipment exposed to salt spray. He'd been at the pier before she arrived, or he'd touched something here that wasn't simply snow. Rachel's pulse slowed. That was what fear did to her when it was serious. It took away wasted speed. "What's going on, Mark?" she asked, voice calm, letting him think she was still confused. Mark's gaze flicked past her shoulder toward the reefer trailer, then back. "I'm trying to keep you from making a mistake," he said. "You've been poking around. I heard you asked for old manifests. I heard you pulled camera logs that weren't assigned to you." Rachel held his gaze. "You heard," she repeated. "From who?" Mark's jaw flexed once. "From people who worry about you," he said, then added softly, "You're good at your job, Rachel. Too good for your own safety." He said it like a compliment, but it sounded like a eulogy rehearsal. Rachel felt something inside her harden, not rage, not grief, but a clean, bright line. Her brother's empty skiff, her mother's quiet face at the funeral that never had a body. The ocean's talent for erasing. "If I'm too good," Rachel said, "why are you trying to stop me?" Mark exhaled through his nose, a controlled release. "Because you don't understand what you're looking at," he said. "This isn't a smuggling ring for cigarettes. This is organized, protected." Rachel's fingers curled inside her gloves. "Protected by who?" Mark's eyes didn't answer, but his silence did. Rachel's mind clicked through the memory card's contents, photos of freezer holds, lists of missing names, and she saw suddenly how a network would survive, not by hiding from law enforcement, but by recruiting it. And Mark Halston, the man who worshipped procedure, would be the perfect priest for a corrupt church. She felt a bitter humor flare. Of course, betrayal always dressed in familiar clothes. "Mark," she said, voice lowered as if she could still reach the version of him she'd trusted, "I'm bringing evidence to Sarah, to Federal, to anyone who'll move. If you're here to help, help. If you're here to intimidate—" Mark's expression finally cracked, not into anger, into something colder, resignation, like a man accepting that the clean path had ended and the dirty work was next. "Give it to me," he said quietly. "Whatever you have, I can get it to the right people." Rachel almost laughed at the audacity. "The right people," she echoed. "Meaning the people who told you to come here?" Mark didn't deny it. That was the answer. The wind shoved snow sideways, pelting their coats. A metal clang sounded near the trailer, something shifting in the dark. Mark's head turned slightly, listening, then back to her. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said, and for the first time his voice held a thread of impatience. Rachel understood then. He hadn't come to persuade. He'd come to retrieve. The warmth in his tone was just a tool. Rachel's hand drifted toward her radio, slow enough to look casual. Mark's eyes tracked the movement instantly. "Don't," he said. One word. Flat. The air between them tightened like a rope. Rachel's internal monologue, usually a neat filing cabinet of facts, spilled into something raw. If I run, he'll chase. If I fight, he's stronger. If I stall, someone might hear. Sarah, Evan, anyone. She forced herself to keep breathing steady because panic made her movements predictable. Mark, she said, and put a strange gentleness into his name. You once told me the ocean takes what it's given. That's why you build cases like seawalls. You really going to be the guy who hands people to the tide? Mark's mouth tightened. For a fraction of a second, regret flickered, real, human, painful. Then it vanished behind the mask of duty to something else. I don't have a choice, he said. Rachel's laugh came out soft and sharp. Everyone has a choice, she replied. Some people just pick the one that lets them sleep. Mark took one more step forward. Rachel didn't step back. She couldn't afford to look afraid. She needed him close enough that his next move would commit him, close enough that her body cam would catch his words, his face, his intent. The camera lens was a tiny eye on her chest. She prayed it was recording. Mark's gaze dropped to her pocket again. Last time, he said. What are you carrying? Rachel's fingers closed around the memory card through the fabric. She thought of the missing names. She thought of a child's sneaker in a freezer hold. Her fear transformed into something else, purpose so clean it felt like ice. A story, she said, and you're standing in it. Mark's eyes narrowed, and the wind seemed to pause, as if the sea itself leaned closer to watch what he would do. He lifted his hand slowly, almost gently toward her coat, and Rachel realized with sick clarity that this was the moment the colleague stopped being human and became a mechanism. Procedure had turned into a trap, and the trap had learned her name. The first blow didn't feel like pain. It felt like the world blinked and forgot to open its eyes again. Rachel Bennett registered a brief flash of Mark Halston's gloved hand reaching for her coat, then a hard, precise impact behind her ear, delivered not with rage, but with the efficiency of a man swatting a fly he'd decided was inconvenient. Sound collapsed into a thick cotton hush. The harbor lights smeared into pale ribbons. For a fraction of a second she thought of her brother's skiff, empty in winter, and the thought arrived with bitter humor. So this is how the sea keeps its receipts. No ink, just absence. When consciousness returned, it came in pieces. Cold first. A cold so intimate it felt like a hand inside her ribs. Then the taste of adhesive and cloth pressed across her mouth, rough enough to scrape the inside of her lips. Her wrists burned. Her shoulders ached in a way that suggested she'd been dragged. She opened her eyes and saw darkness framed by glass. But the glass was wrong. Not the wide windshield of her SUV. Narrower, angled, fogged with salt. A console panel blinked with dying LEDs, and above it the outline of a helm wheel floated like a drowned halo. She was in a boat cabin. Her brain tried to deny it because denial was the first defense against panic, but the roll beneath her body, the slow, nauseating sway, proved the truth. Her arms were pinned behind her. She twisted, and the rope bit deeper, thick nylon cinched around her chest and the chair back, looped twice like someone had taken pride in the knot. Her ankles were bound to the chair legs. Her wrists were zip-tied together behind her spine, numb already, and the zip ties had been pulled so tight the plastic teeth felt fused to bone. Mark hadn't brought cuffs. He'd brought something quieter, something disposable. The cabin smelled of diesel, old fish, and the metallic sting of seawater. Rachel's mind raced through questions, each one slamming into the next. How long? Where? Why a boat? Then she remembered the reefer trailer, the gate override, the corridor of disappearing signals. A boat was cleaner than a parking lot. A boat gave the storm cover, the sea a motive, and the paperwork a story, accident. She tried to shout, but the gag swallowed it, turning it into a muffled animal sound that made shame flare hot and useless in her chest. Shame was a trick, the body's way of trying to control the uncontrollable. Rachel forced it down. Think. The chair was bolted to the deck. She tested it with a full-body pull. It didn't budge. Her body cam gone, her radio gone, her pocket empty. The memory card. She couldn't feel it. Her stomach dropped, then steadied as her mind did something strange. It split. One part screamed, "He took it." One part answered, "Not if you were smart." In Chapter 1 she'd made 2 copies. One was with Evan, locked and encrypted. Sarah had the ping. If Rachel vanished, the station would move. If. The cabin door creaked, and a shape filled the frame. Mark Halston stepped in as if he owned the air. Under the dim cabin light, his face looked carved from fatigue, jaw angles sharper, the stubble along his chin darker with wet. Snow clung to his coat shoulders and melted into the wool like the storm was trying to erase him too. His eyes, steady brown, held no surprise at seeing her awake. He had planned for wakefulness. That was the terrifying thing about him tonight. Nothing in him felt spontaneous, even cruelty. Mark closed the door behind him, turning the latch, sealing her in with the sound of a coffin deciding it preferred quiet. "You're awake," he said calmly. Rachel's throat tightened around a curse she couldn't speak. Her eyes burned with anger so bright it almost warmed her. Mark moved to the console and flicked a switch. The cabin lights brightened briefly, then dimmed again, like a heartbeat failing. He checked the instrument panel with professional familiarity. So he'd been on boats before. Rachel watched his hands, large, capable, gloved, steady, hands that once held evidence bags with reverence. Hands that now treated a human being like freight. Mark glanced at her, and his expression held a trace of something like apology. It was worse than hatred. Hatred at least admitted she mattered. Apology meant he thought he was still the good guy. "I didn't want it to be this way," he said. Rachel forced herself to breathe through her nose, steady, slow. She tried to communicate with her eyes because eyes were all she had. Her gaze flicked to the cabin window, to the dark water beyond, then back to him. Question: where are we? Mark's mouth tightened as if he understood her anyway. "Out past the point," he said. "Enough that no one hears you, enough that the storm will do what storms do." He leaned closer and Rachel caught the faint scent of aftershave beneath diesel, the intimate detail of someone you once trusted. It made bile rise. Mark reached into his coat and pulled out a small item wrapped in a plastic sleeve. He held it up in the dim light. It was her memory card. Rachel felt a brief, stabbing grief, not for herself, but for the missing names on that list, for the child's sneaker, for every face that had waited for someone like her to keep their promise. Mark saw the change in her eyes and softened his voice. "You were going to get yourself killed," he said, as if he were the one preventing tragedy rather than manufacturing it. "I'm saving you from something bigger than you understand." Rachel's laugh came out as a choked sound against the gag. Mark sighed, almost weary, and tucked the card away. "You don't believe me," he said. "That's fine. You don't have to. This ends either way." He turned back to the console and clicked another switch. Somewhere below deck, metal groaned. A pump started and then stopped. The boat's hull vibrated with a sound that didn't belong to normal motion, a harsh, scraping strain, like something being forced open. Rachel's eyes widened. Mark's gaze met hers. "There's a weakness in the aft window frame," he said, matter of fact. "Older boat, salt rot. I'm going to make it fail." He spoke like he was explaining a repair. "When it goes, the cabin floods fast. You'll be found later, if you're found at all. Everyone will say it's tragic. They'll say you were brave. They'll give Sarah a plaque and a folded flag." The casualness in his tone made Rachel's skin crawl. It wasn't just that he planned her death. It was that he planned the narrative. Mark stepped toward the cabin wall and opened a small panel with a screwdriver. Behind it was wiring, old and patched. He produced a compact tool, a punch, or a spike something designed to crack glass. He held it in his hand like an extension of procedure. Rachel's heartbeat hammered, but her mind sharpened again into that clean, icy focus. If she couldn't fight him directly, she had to change the environment. Boats were systems. Systems had failures. She scanned the cabin. A flare canister bracketed near the door, a fire extinguisher strapped to the bulkhead, a small hatchet clipped by the console. Too far. Out of reach. She tried to rock the chair forward. No give. Her shoulders screamed. The rope didn't loosen. Mark raised the spike toward the aft window. Rachel knew what would happen. One puncture, then a spiderweb crack, then the sea would push itself into the cabin like a god reclaiming tribute. Cold water, panic, death in minutes. She needed time. She needed noise. She needed, at minimum, to make this less clean. Mark struck once. A sharp crack split the air, and the window shuddered. A thin line appeared, glowing pale where outside light seeped in. Mark struck again, and the crack spread like lightning. A faint hiss followed, air pressure changing, water pressing. Rachel's breath hitched. She closed her eyes for half a beat and forced the panic down, the way her father used to force his hands steady tying knots at the dock. Think. What did she have? Her teeth, her legs, her weight. She threw her full body sideways, slamming the chair against the console edge. The impact sent a burst of pain up her spine, but it also knocked the console drawer open a few inches. A small scatter of items tumbled, a folded chart, a pen light, and thank God an old multi-tool that clinked against the deck near her boot. Rachel's heart leapt. The multi-tool was just beyond her toe, but close enough that she could reach if she could shift. Mark turned, eyes narrowing. "Stop," he said, voice hard now. Rachel didn't stop. She kept rocking, dragging the chair leg by millimeters, scraping metal against the deck. The sound was ugly, loud, defiant. Mark crossed the cabin in 2 steps and grabbed the chair back, shoving her upright. His grip was strong, controlled, but his jaw had tightened irritation, not fear. He didn't want to struggle. Struggles left marks. "You're making this worse," he muttered. Rachel stared at him with a hatred so clear it felt like language. Mark's hand rose. Rachel braced for another blow. Instead, he reached for the gag tape, and for a wild second she thought he was going to let her speak. Then he pulled it tighter, reinforcing it, adding another strip across her lips and around her head. The tape tugged her skin, and tears sprang involuntarily to her eyes from the sting. Mark's face hovered close. "No one is coming," he said softly. "The storm is your witness, and storms don't testify." He moved away again, returned to the window, and struck a 3rd time. The glass gave with a deeper, uglier sound. A chunk caved inward, and a tongue of black water surged through, immediate and violent, splashing the cabin floor and racing toward Rachel's boots. The cold was savage. It stole breath. It climbed like an animal. Rachel jerked, but the chair held her. Water curled around the chair legs, rising fast, sloshing with each roll of the boat. The cabin lights flickered, then steadied like mocking. Mark watched for a moment, assessing the flow, then turned toward the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, and Rachel saw again that brief flicker of regret. It didn't soften her. It made her rage hotter. Mark glanced back once. "I'm sorry," he said. And the lie in that apology was the most horrifying truth of all. He stepped out and shut the door behind him. The latch clicked. The sound was small, final. Water rose past Rachel's ankles in seconds, soaking her pant legs, turning fabric into lead. The cabin filled with the low roar of incoming sea, a sound that drowned out thought if you let it. Rachel forced herself not to let it. She twisted at the rope, trying to reach the multi-tool with her boot. The water shoved her foot away. She fought it, toes straining, and managed to hook the edge of the tool with her heel, dragging it closer an inch at a time. The water climbed to her knees. Numbness crept up her calves, a cold so intense it felt like burning. Her hands behind her were useless, fingers tingling with lost circulation. The multi-tool bumped against her boot toe. She couldn't pick it up. She could only keep it near, like hope you couldn't hold yet, but refused to abandon. The boat lurched. A wave struck the hull, and the cabin rocked. Water slammed against Rachel's thighs, splashing her waist. She gasped through her nose, breath sharp, fogging the tape around her mouth. She thought of Sarah, iron-haired and stubborn, sitting under the map with pins, promising procedure and witnesses. She thought of Evan, anxious and brave in his own quiet way, typing through fear. She clung to the fact that she'd sent the ping. She clung to the second copy of the evidence. She told herself again and again, like a prayer with teeth, "Even if I drown, the truth doesn't have to." Water reached her stomach, then her ribs, stealing warmth, compressing lungs. The cabin's dim light blurred as her eyes watered, lashes stiffening with salt. Her heart hammered, then began to slow, the body's cruel trick, the cold trying to persuade her to sleep. Rachel fought it by focusing on details, counting the blinking lights, naming them, anchoring her mind to anything that wasn't fear. 1 blink, 2, 3. The water rose to her chest. She lifted her chin, the tape tightening across her cheekbones. She tried to scream, but the sound died inside her skull. The multi-tool floated briefly, bumped her leg, then sank again as water turbulence pinned it under the chair. Rachel felt the edges of her vision sparkle white. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, the storm continued to rage, indifferent. And yet, beneath the roar of water, she heard something else. Not loud, not certain, but distinct enough to hook into her mind like a lifeline, a low, distant horn, or perhaps the thrum of an engine cutting through the waves. It might have been real. It might have been the brain's last trick. Rachel didn't know. She only knew one thing. She refused to vanish quietly. She drew in a breath through her nose, held it, and slammed her head back against the chair. Once, twice, 3 times, using pain as a beacon, as if pain could send a message through water and storm. I am here. I am still here. The cabin filled higher, swallowing the last dry air in greedy gulps. Rachel's world narrowed to cold and dark and the stubborn, furious pulse inside her chest. And just before the water reached her throat, she caught a sound again, closer now, unmistakably mechanical, like a boat turning hard against the wind. Her eyes widened, her body surged with a last desperate hope. She tried to kick the cabin wall, to rattle anything that could carry vibration outward. The boat rocked. The light flickered, and the sea kept rising, patient as death, as Rachel's breath became a countdown she couldn't read. The ocean didn't roar for drama. It roared because that was its language, a brutal vowel of wind and water that never learned gentleness. Beyond the harbor mouth, waves rose like black walls and collapsed into white, and every burst of spray turned to needles in the air. Inside the flooded cabin, Rachel Bennett's world had narrowed to cold and darkness and the stubborn rhythm of a heart refusing to be negotiated with. Outside, in the same storm, another heartbeat listened, trained, bruised, and unwilling to ignore what most people called "not my problem." Jack Mercer guided his small rescue skiff along the edge of the channel markers with the kind of focus that looked calm only because panic had been burned out of him years ago. He was 35, tall and wiry, built like a man who'd spent his life fighting currents instead of lifting weights. His shoulders were roped with lean muscle, not showy, just functional, made for hauling lines, pulling bodies, climbing ladders slick with ice. Salt had roughened his skin into a permanent tan that winter couldn't fully bleach, and a thin scar cut through one eyebrow, giving his gaze an unintentional intensity. His hair was dark brown, kept short under a knit cap, always damp, always wind-tousled, and his beard came in heavy along his jaw and chin trimmed close, because long beards froze, and Payne was an instructor he'd paid enough tuition to already. Jack's eyes were a deep blue that looked almost black in stormlight, and people who met him often mistook his quietness for coldness. It wasn't coldness, it was restraint. Years ago, during a Navy rescue dive off the Carolinas, Jack had surfaced too late with a man in his arms, too late by seconds that stretched into a lifetime. The official report said conditions severe. Jack's mind said, you hesitated. Since then, he'd lived like a man allergic to hesitation. He left the service, took private salvage and rescue contracts, and pretended he liked working alone because it meant less risk of losing people. The truth was uglier. If you worked alone, there were fewer faces to haunt you. Tonight, he was returning from checking a mooring line for an elderly lobsterman who'd refused to come ashore because stubbornness was a local religion. The job had been simple. The sea had been not. He kept the bow angled into the chop, throttle steady, the engine's growl fighting the wind's scream. The instrument panel glowed dim red, and the compass needle jittered like it wanted to run away. Beside Jack, braced on the non-slip deck, stood his partner, the only one who didn't talk, didn't lie, didn't pretend anything was fine. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, black and tan, with a classic saddle pattern, thick winter coat already crusted with salt ice along the ridge of his back. His body was long and athletic, not bulky, built for endurance. One ear tipped slightly at the end, a small permanent bend that gave him a look of questioning skepticism, like he didn't believe in humans until they proved themselves. His eyes were amber, bright and sharp, and they missed nothing. A faint scar traced his right flank, where some past shrapnel or debris had kissed too close. You could feel it under the fur if you ran your hand along him, a raised line like an old story written in skin. Jack didn't call him by some macho name like Titan or Bear. The dog's name was Bishop, because the first time Jack saw him, the shepherd moved across a training field like a chess piece, purposeful and silent, always guarding something invisible. Bishop had once served with a coastal law enforcement K-9 unit, then been reassigned after an explosion during a dock fire left his handler injured. The dog had been labeled too reactive afterward, which in bureaucratic language often meant too alive, too aware, too unwilling to pretend danger wasn't real. Jack understood that kind of label. He'd adopted Bishop without ceremony, just a leash and a nod, two creatures that recognized the same unfinished sentence in each other. Bishop didn't wear a flashy vest. He wore a worn harness and a simple ID tag. He didn't bark for fun. When he barked, something was wrong. Jack's gloved hand rested on the wheel. His other hand rested on the throttle. His mind was already halfway ashore, thinking about the small shack he called home wood stove, dry socks, silence. Then Bishop's posture changed. It wasn't dramatic, it was precise. The shepherd's head snapped toward starboard, nose lifting, nostrils flaring, his tail lowered slightly, stiff, not wagging. The fur along his shoulders rose in a thin ridge. He made a sound low in his throat, not a growl meant to threaten, but a vibration that said the world had shifted. Jack followed the dog's line of sight into darkness. At first he saw only waves and wind-whipped spray. Then he smelled it. Diesel, sharp and wrong, carried on the gale. Metal, too, the cold tang of something torn open. Under it all, faint but unmistakable, a scent Jack hadn't encountered in a long time without consequences: fear. Bishop let out one bark, short and hard, a working alert. Not, "Look at me." Not, "I'm excited." It was the sound of a compass needle slamming toward true north. "What is it?" Jack shouted, voice ripped thin by wind. Bishop didn't look at him. He took 2 steps toward the rail, claws gripping the deck, nose pointed toward a stretch of water near the rocky lee beyond the channel markers where the storm's foam masked everything and the darkness hid its mouth. Jack's instincts, long starved for anything but routine, tightened into a blade. He eased the throttle down, turning the skiff carefully, letting the bow swing. The sea slapped the hull with immediate offense. The wind shoved. Jack countered, jaw clenched. "Easy," he muttered, not to the dog, but to himself. Because the ocean loved overconfidence. It punished it. Bishop barked again, then whined once rare, controlled, like a crack in steel. Jack's eyes searched the chaos. A flash. Not lightning. A weak stutter of light, half hidden behind a cresting wave like a dying bulb under water. Jack's stomach dropped. He swung the beam of his deck light across the surface, the cone of illumination carving through blowing snow. For a moment, nothing. Then the light caught a shape. The dark curve of a cabin roof, low in the water, and the faint outline of windows. A small vessel, half submerged, pitched at an angle as if trying to bow out of the world. Jack's breath hitched. "Jesus," he hissed. Bishop's body went taut, his paws scrabbling, desperate to launch himself into the black. Jack grabbed the harness handle automatically. "No," he said. "Not yet." He brought the skiff closer, slow, careful, because ice skim floated in patches and one wrong hit could cripple his propeller. The waves shoved the half-sunk vessel against the chop, making it groan. Jack recognized the type. A small patrol boat or harbor craft, not a big trawler. The cabin windows were fogged and wet from the inside. The weakest light stuttered behind one pane, then died. Bishop barked again, louder now, urgent. Jack swung his light and saw it. A shadow inside, upright in a chair, head tilted back, something pale across the mouth. Human, alive or recently. Jack's brain snapped into the old training channel, the one that didn't allow room for disbelief. He clipped a safety line to his belt, anchored it to the skiff cleat, and pulled on a pair of heavy gloves designed for wet work. "Stay," he told Bishop, and the dog, for once, didn't obey. Bishop planted himself at the rail, muscles quivering, eyes locked on the cabin window like he could will it open. Jack didn't waste time arguing. He grabbed the boat hook and used it to catch the sinking vessel's rail, pulling the skiff alongside with a jolt that sent both hulls slamming in the swell. The sea tried to pry them apart. Jack fought it, knees bent, body low, distributing weight. He slammed a fender between the hulls to keep metal from biting metal, then climbed onto the half-submerged boat with the quick, ugly grace of someone who'd done this in worse conditions. The deck was slick with ice and seawater. It pitched under him. He went down on one knee, spreading his weight, and crawled toward the cabin door. Bishop leapt after him without command, landing with a thud, claws scraping for purchase. The dog's presence was both comfort and hazard. Extra weight on a compromised deck, but Jack didn't have the heart to send him back into the skiff alone. Bishop moved low, ears forward, as if the wind itself might attack. Jack reached the cabin door and tried the handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. He slammed his shoulder into it once. The frame rattled but held. He heard water gurgling inside, the sound of a room filling. Jack's pulse hammered, but his movements stayed clean. He pulled a compact pry bar from his belt, a habit from salvage work, and wedged it into the seam. The metal bit. He levered carefully. The door gave a fraction. Water surged against it from inside, pushing back like a beast. Jack swore. He adjusted the angle, braced his feet, and shoved again. The latch snapped with a crack that sounded like bone. The door swung inward, and a spill of icy water slapped his boots. Bishop lunged past him, barking into the cabin, frantic now. Jack's headlamp beam swept the interior and landed on a woman bound to a chair, gagged, soaked, eyes wide and glassy with cold. Her face was pale beneath wet hair, and even in the harsh light Jack saw something stubborn in her, an anger that refused to go out. Rachel Bennett met his gaze, and Jack felt the old, familiar jolt. The moment rescue stopped being theory and became a person. The cabin water was already waist-high around the chair legs. Jack moved in fast. "Hold on," he said, voice loud, commanding, not because she could answer, but because words sometimes kept the mind from slipping. He reached for the gag tape, fingers numb, and ripped it free. Rachel's mouth opened, and a sound came out. Half cough, half broken breath. She tried. Jack cut her off gently. "Later," he said. "You breathe now." He grabbed a knife and sliced through the rope across her chest. The rope snapped back, whipping his glove. He cut again, freeing her shoulders. Water slammed against his thighs as the boat rocked. Bishop pressed his body against Rachel's leg, whining, sharing warmth like a living blanket. Jack reached behind the chair for the zip ties on her wrists. His knife edge sawed through plastic. Rachel gasped as sensation returned in pins and needles. Her eyes fluttered, threatening to roll. Jack hooked an arm under her shoulders and hauled her up, careful not to jerk her too fast in the cold. "Come on," he muttered, more prayer than command. The boat lurched hard. A new wave struck. The cabin floor tilted, and water surged higher, rising with hungry speed. Jack felt the vessel settling. Time was collapsing. He dragged Rachel toward the door, Bishop barking, pushing, guiding as if he could herd a human the way he herded chaos. Rachel's boots caught on something. Maybe the chair leg, maybe the multi-tool she'd tried to reach. Jack yanked her free. He didn't look down. He didn't have the luxury. He got her to the threshold, then threw her weight forward into his chest and stepped out onto the deck, the wind punching them immediately. Rachel shuddered so violently her teeth clacked. Jack swung her toward the skiff, but the gap between hulls had widened with the swell. "Bishop, down!" he snapped, and the dog dropped low instantly, ears still forward, eyes blazing. Jack waited for the swell to lift his skiff, then heaved Rachel across the gap, landing her on the rescue skiff's deck with a thud. She lay there, curling instinctively, arms tight to her body, trying to keep heat. Jack grabbed the safety line and pulled himself across next, boots slipping, knee slamming the rail. Pain flared. He ignored it. He hauled Bishop across by the harness handle, and the shepherd landed sure-footed, immediately returning to Rachel's side. Behind them, the half-submerged boat groaned, as if protesting being denied its offering. The cabin light flickered once, then went out forever. Jack slammed the skiff into gear and turned hard toward the harbor lights, throttle roaring. The storm tried to shove him sideways. Jack refused. He glanced back once at Rachel, her face turned toward him, lips blue-tinged, eyes still fighting to focus. "Stay with me," he said, and meant it with the intensity of a man bargaining with fate. Rachel swallowed, voice raw. "My name, Rachel," she rasped. Jack nodded, jaw set. "Jack," he replied, "and this is Bishop." Bishop's tail thumped once, not joyful, but determined, as if agreeing to a contract older than law. The skiff punched through the chop toward shore, and behind them the sea snapped shut, angry and disappointed, because it had been robbed of a clean disappearance. Jack Mercer didn't head straight for comfort. He headed for control. The skiff slammed through chop toward the inner harbor, engine straining as if it had its own opinion about survival. Wind drove snow sideways in sheets that made the world look like a film reel being shredded, and the channel markers bobbed like nervous witnesses. Rachel Bennett lay on the deck wrapped in Jack's spare tarp and an emergency blanket that crinkled like foil in the gale. The blanket reflected the skiff's running lights back at her in jittering flashes, green, red, green, like a lighthouse trying to speak in Morse to someone who had forgotten how to read hope. Her skin had that dangerous, waxy pallor of someone who'd been taxed by cold water. Her lips were tinged blue, and her jaw tremored in violent shivers that were less a sign of warmth returning than her body refusing to surrender quietly. Jack kept one hand on the throttle and one eye on her, checking the rhythm of her breathing in quick glances, the way divers checked gauges without thinking. Bishop pressed along her side, chest to her ribs, sharing heat with the stubborn devotion of a creature who didn't require permission to care. The German shepherd's thick black and tan coat was soaked and crusted, and salt ice clung to his whiskers like glitter stolen from the sea. His amber eyes stayed on Rachel's face, alert, unblinking, scanning for any sign that she'd drift too far away. Jack could see, even over the storm, that Rachel's gaze was fighting to focus. She'd given him her name. That had been her anchor. Now she needed another. "Stay with me, Rachel," Jack said again, voice loud enough to cut through wind. "Breathe, in through your nose. Slow." Rachel's eyelids fluttered, her breath hitched. The shivering intensified, then steadied into a rhythmic tremor. Mark," she rasped, each syllable scraped raw. "He did this." Jack's jaw tightened. The name meant nothing to him yet, but the tone meant everything. Betrayal. He'd heard it before in men pulled from wrecks who didn't complain about pain, only about who put them there. "Don't talk," he ordered gently. "Not now. Save it." Rachel tried to argue with her eyes. Jack shook his head, not unkind. "You'll get your say when you're warm." The harbor mouth finally swallowed them into slightly calmer water, though calm was relative, like calling a knife less sharp because it hadn't cut you yet. Jack swung the skiff toward a service dock lit by 2 sodium lamps that painted the snow a sickly orange. He chose it because it was close, and because it had a ladder, and because he didn't want to drag Rachel through a public marina where curious phones would turn her near death into entertainment. He cut throttle and let the skiff drift in on the swell, bumping softly against the fenders. He threw a line, looped it with hands that didn't shake, and tied off fast. Bishop whined once, low, protective. Jack jumped onto the dock, boots hitting wood slick with ice. He grabbed a second line to stabilize, then climbed back down into the skiff and scooped Rachel under the shoulders. She weighed less than she should have, lean strength drained out by cold shock. Jack lifted her carefully, mindful of the way hypothermia could make a body fragile as glass. Bishop scrambled up onto the dock beside them, claws skittering, then planted himself close, tail low, scanning the darkness for threats that weren't only weather. Jack carried Rachel into a small heated storage shed at the edge of the dock, one he'd used before when storms forced him to take shelter. The shed smelled of old rope, rust, and cheap propane heat. He kicked the door shut behind them, and the sudden reduction of wind made the silence feel loud. He laid Rachel on a wooden bench, then knelt, assessing like a medic. Breathing, pulse, skin, consciousness. Her pulse was fast and thin. She was conscious but glassy, fighting to stay. Shivering was still active, which was good, but her hands were pale and numb, and the skin around her wrists showed angry red marks where zip ties had bitten. Jack's mouth hardened. He'd seen ropes, he'd seen cuffs. Zip ties were what people used when they didn't plan to bring you back. He stripped off Rachel's soaked outer jacket and gloves with careful efficiency, speaking the whole time in a steady voice because silence was an invitation for fear. "You're going to hate this," he warned, "but you're going to live through it." Rachel tried to nod. It came out like a weak tremor. Jack pulled dry wool blankets from a storage bin, wrapped her, then took a thermos from his pack-warm water with electrolyte powder, not coffee, not alcohol, not anything that would shock her system. He held the cup to her lips. "Small sips," he instructed, "not heroic gulps." Bishop gave a short huff that sounded suspiciously like agreement. Rachel managed 2 tiny swallows, coughing once. Jack watched the color in her lips, the way her breathing responded. Then he pulled a satellite phone from his dry bag, scuffed, reliable, the kind you carried when you didn't trust cell towers to keep promises in bad weather. He punched in an emergency number for the local Coast Guard station, then a secondary number he'd been given by an old rescue contact. A voice answered, clipped, professional. Jack gave the location, the situation, the immediate medical needs. "Female officer," he said. "Hypothermia, restraints marks, possible assault. I found her in a sinking patrol craft outside the channel." There was a pause on the line that told Jack he'd just stepped into someone else's war. "Stay where you are," the voice ordered. "Medical is en route. Do not move her unnecessarily." Jack almost laughed at the idea he hadn't already moved her a mile through death. "I'm in a heated shed," he replied. "She's stable for the moment." "Who are you?" the voice demanded. Jack gave his name and credentials, the bare minimum. The line went quiet again, then returned with a different toneless suspicion, more urgency. "Copy. We'll be there." Jack ended the call and exhaled. The relief didn't make him softer, it made him sharper, because now the other part of his mind woke up fully, the part that asked why, the part that didn't believe in accidents that came with zip ties and gag tape. Rachel's eyes tracked him, fighting through fog. "The memory card," she whispered. Jack crouched near her. "He took it," she said. "Mark took it. He staged the boat." Her words came in fragments, broken by shivers, but the meaning was clear. Jack's jaw clenched. "You have a backup?" he asked, not because he expected miracles, but because he respected people who planned. Rachel's eyelids fluttered. "Yes," she breathed. "Evan? Sarah? Second copy." Jack didn't know who Evan was yet, but the name Sarah made Rachel's face soften for a heartbeat trust. "Good," Jack said. "Then you didn't lose everything." Rachel swallowed. "The trailer," she rasped. "Pier 9, reefer, after hours. He was there. He asked, What I had. Jack's eyes narrowed. He imagined a refrigerated trailer moving in a storm, gates overridden, cameras blurred. He imagined Mark Halston stepping out of the dark with a smile meant to feel safe. Jack had seen men like that, the ones who weaponized calm. "Don't push," Jack warned, seeing her trying to force clarity through cold. "Tell me one thing," he said. "Is he alone?" Rachel's gaze shifted, as if her mind was replaying a scene she didn't want to watch. "No," she whispered. "Protected." He said protected. Jack held that word. Protected meant network. Protected meant that even if Mark got arrested, the machine would keep moving. Protected meant Rachel hadn't been attacked by a man. She'd been attacked by an organization that had decided she was a liability. The door of the shed rattled briefly under a gust, and Bishop's head snapped up, ears forward, body tensing. Jack glanced at the shepherd. The dog's hackles rose slightly, not because he sensed someone outside, just because he sensed that danger didn't end with warmth. Jack stood and checked the latch, then looked back at Rachel. "Listen," he said, low now, because this was the part where fear would try to climb back into her chest and choke her. "Whoever did this thinks you're going to disappear. That buys us time, but not much." Rachel's eyes widened slightly. Jack saw the question forming. Why would you help? Why would you risk it? People asked that when they had been abandoned by someone they trusted. Jack didn't answer with speeches. He answered with action. He adjusted the blankets around her shoulders, then held up 2 fingers in front of her face. "Look at me," he said. "How many?" Rachel blinked, forcing focus. 2, she rasped. "Good," Jack said. "Stay with me. Your brain needs to keep working." He turned to Bishop and checked the dog's harness straps, rubbing the shepherd's neck briefly, part comfort, part thanks. Bishop leaned into the touch for half a second, then returned his gaze to Rachel, as if his assignment was non-negotiable. Outside, a siren wailed faintly, the sound stretched by wind, then grew louder. Headlights swept across the snow through cracks in the shed wall. Jack opened the door just enough to look. A Coast Guard response truck and an ambulance were pulling up, tires crunching. 2 medics jumped out, moving fast. One of them, a woman in her late 30s with dark hair stuffed under a knit cap and a broad face weathered by the kind of work that didn't happen indoors, carried a trauma bag like it was part of her body. She had the calm, blunt posture of someone who had seen enough bleeding to stop flinching. Another medic, younger, followed with a stretcher. A Coast Guard petty officer stepped with them, tall and square, face red from wind, eyes scanning the dock like he expected gunfire from the snowdrifts. Jack opened the shed door wider. "She's in here," he said. The lead medic stepped in and immediately assessed Rachel with a quick, competent sweep. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she asked, voice firm but kind. Rachel's eyes turned toward her. "Yes," Rachel whispered. "Name?" "Rachel Bennett," she forced out. The medic nodded. "Good, we've got you." She checked Rachel's pulse, then the marks on her wrists, her pupils, her temperature. Her expression tightened when she saw the restraint injuries. "Who did this?" she demanded. Jack stepped in before Rachel tried to speak too much. "Later," he said to the medic. "She's got hypothermia. Keep her steady." The medic shot him a look that said, "Who are you to give orders?" Jack met it with the look of someone who'd pulled people out of worse. The medic's expression shifted from irritation to grudging respect. "Fine," she said. "We warm her slow." They slid a heated pack near Rachel's core, wrapped her tighter, and carefully transferred her onto the stretcher. Bishop rose, tail low, stepping close as if he intended to climb onto the stretcher too. The medic glanced at the dog. "Service?" Jack nodded. "Working dog," he said. "He's with her. He found her first." The medic hesitated, then allowed Bishop to walk alongside, close enough that his warmth could still reach her. As they rolled Rachel out into the storm-lit dock, she gripped Jack's sleeve weakly. Her fingers were numb, but the intent was clear. "Don't leave me alone with strangers yet." Jack bent close. "I'm here," he promised. "And your evidence copy is still out there. That's the part they didn't drown. Rachel's eyes closed briefly, a tear freezing at the corner. The Coast Guard petty officer leaned in, voice sharp. "Sir, we need a statement." "Where did you find her? What vessel?" Jack gave him the basics, keeping his words clean: location, sinking craft, restraints, staged breach. The petty officer's face tightened as he listened, eyes flicking to Rachel, then to the dark harbor. "This just became a criminal case," he muttered. Jack watched Rachel wheeled toward the ambulance, Bishop pacing beside her like a shadow with teeth. He felt the old itch in his chest, the one that had driven him into rescue diving in the first place, returning not as heroism but as obligation. He'd pulled her from the sea. Now he had to decide whether he'd put her back into the world and walk away, or whether he'd follow the thread she'd handed him into something colder than water, a human machine that ate people and called it shipping. Jack's eyes went to the harbor lights, then to the dark gap beyond the channel where the sinking boat had vanished. The ocean had tried to lock the door. Tonight, it hadn't succeeded. Jack wasn't sure if that made the world safer or simply more honest about its monsters. By the time the storm loosened its grip, dawn didn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like an exhausted breath. The sky over the Gulf of Maine turned a bruised gray, and the snow softened from needles into a steady, quiet fall, as if even the weather had realized it had pushed too hard. Jack Mercer sat in the ambulance bay outside a small coastal clinic, shoulders hunched inside his salt-stiff coat, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee he hadn't tasted in 10 minutes. The heat from it rose into his face and vanished, unable to win against the chill that lived in his bones. Bishop lay at his boots, soaked fur dried into stiff curls at the edges, cone-free and stubbornly upright, ears tracking every door that opened. The German shepherd's amber eyes were still too bright for a night that should have emptied them. He looked like a sentry carved from winter quiet, tense, ready to launch. Jack kept glancing at the door marked "Emergency," waiting for someone to come out and say the words that always rearranged a life: stable, critical, gone. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself he'd done his part. He told himself a lot of things that sounded neat in his head and false in his chest. A nurse pushed through the doors at last, wiping her hands on her scrubs. She was short, early 30s, with dark skin and a round face that carried a permanent expression of practical impatience. Like the world's nonsense annoyed her, but didn't surprise her anymore. Her hair was braided tight and tucked under a cap, and her eyes, behind clear protective glasses, were alert and tired in the way only medical workers got, the fatigue of someone who never fully clocked out. Her name badge read Maya Ortiz. She looked at Jack, then at Bishop, then back at Jack with the faintest upward twitch of her mouth. "Your friend's stubborn," she said. Jack blinked. "Rachel?" Maya shook her head. "The dog. He tried to follow the gurney right into triage. I told him this isn't a kennel. He disagreed." Bishop's tail thumped once small, offended, as if he'd been accused of loitering. Maya's tone softened slightly. "She's alive," she added, and the words hit Jack like a warm hand on the back of his neck. He hadn't realized how tight his chest had been until it loosened. "Hypothermia, bruising, some wrist damage. Nothing we can't treat if she keeps fighting." Jack nodded, a silent thank you he didn't know how to say without feeling exposed. "Can I see her?" he asked. Maya considered him, measuring the salt on his coat, the calm in his posture, the dog at his feet. 2 minutes, she said. "No speeches, no questions that make her talk. She needs warmth, not testimony." Jack almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and meant it. Maya waved him in. The hall smelled of antiseptic and wet wool. The fluorescent lights made everything look too honest. Rachel Bennett lay in the curtained bay under warmed blankets, her skin less waxy now, color returning in cautious increments like someone turning a dial. Her hair, usually pinned tight, was loose and damp, sticking to her cheek. One cheekbone was bruised, a purple shadow that made her look both fragile and furious. Her eyes were open. That was the first thing Jack noticed. Open, sharp, tracking him the moment he stepped in, the way cops watch doors even from hospital beds. Bishop padded in after him, quiet as fog, and stopped at the foot of the bed. Rachel's gaze dropped to the dog, and something uncoiled in her expression: relief, gratitude, and a quick flash of humor that didn't have enough energy to become a smile. "He's still on duty," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, as if the ocean had scraped it raw. Jack stepped closer but kept his distance, respecting the medical space. "He doesn't clock out," Jack said. Bishop huffed, offended by the implication that he ever took breaks. Rachel's eyes flicked to Jack. "Thank you," she said, and the words were plain, but her tone carried the weight of a person who didn't hand out trust easily. Jack's throat tightened. "You did the hard part," he answered. "You stayed." Rachel stared at the ceiling for a moment, as if testing the stability of the world above her. "Mark will come," she said, and this time there was no weakness in her voice, only certainty. "If he thinks I'm alive, he'll finish it." Jack's jaw set. "They have security?" he asked. Rachel's eyes slid back to him. "Not the kind you see," she murmured. "The kind that wears uniforms." Jack felt that phrase settle heavy in his gut. It matched what he'd suspected. This wasn't one man. This was a machine. Rachel's right wrist was bandaged. She lifted her left hand slightly, fingers trembling with fatigue, and reached toward the edge of the blanket near her ribs. "I have something," she whispered. Jack leaned in. Under the blanket, taped to the inside of her thermal shirt near her sternum, was a small plastic rectangle, another memory card sealed in a tiny waterproof sleeve. Jack's eyebrows lifted. Rachel's eyes held a faint, grim pride. "I hid it," she said. "Not the main one, a partial. He didn't find it." Jack stared at the card as if it might burn him. He had assumed Mark had taken everything. Rachel had outplayed him by inches, the way you outplay death by refusing to be tidy. "You kept it on you through the water?" Jack asked. Rachel's mouth twitched. "I didn't want the ocean to have it," she said. Bishop's ears perked as if he understood the word ocean as an enemy. Jack took the memory card carefully, not because it was delicate, but because it felt like holding a live wire. "What's on it?" he asked. Rachel swallowed, then spoke in short bursts, conserving breath. "AIS gaps, trailer plate, a photo of the reefer manifest, and a name." Her gaze sharpened. "Mark's contact, not the boss. A handler." Jack's mind moved fast. "Where's the full copy?" Rachel's eyelids fluttered. "At the station. Evan Price copied it. Sarah Monroe knows. But Mark might already be moving." Jack felt urgency spike. "Do you trust Sarah?" he asked. Rachel's eyes didn't hesitate. "With my life," she said. "She'll do this right. But she'll do it by procedure. And procedure takes time." Jack exhaled. He understood Sarah's kind of strength even without meeting her, the kind that believed in systems because systems were the only way to protect more than one person at once. Jack's strength had always been the opposite. Act now, apologize later, keep breathing. "Rachel," he said quietly, "if Mark has uniforms, then you can't go back to your station right now." Rachel's jaw tightened. "I know," she whispered, "but I need to get this to Sarah." Jack looked down at the card in his palm. He felt the old tug inside himself, the one that always tried to push him back into quiet, into the cabin, into pretending he didn't hear the world drowning. But the dog at his feet had heard it. Rachel had heard it. Now Jack had too. "Give me her number," Jack said. Rachel blinked, then recited it. Jack stepped into the hallway, pulled his satellite phone, and dialed. The line connected after 2 rings. Sarah Monroe's voice came through, low and steady, carrying the exhausted authority of a woman who'd been awake too long but refused to be anything but clear. "This is Harbor Master Monroe," she said. "Who is this?" Jack introduced himself quickly, leaving out drama. "I pulled Officer Rachel Bennett from a sinking patrol craft," he said. He heard Sarah inhale sharply, a rare crack in her composure. "Is she alive?" Jack cut in. "She's at the clinic. Hypothermia. She says you have the evidence copy. She also has a partial memory card she hid. I have it." The silence on the line lasted half a second, but Jack could feel Sarah's mind working. Sarah was the kind of woman who didn't waste breath on panic. She turned it into decisions. "Listen carefully," Sarah said. "Do not bring that to the station. If Mark's involved, then the station is compromised. I've already locked Evan in my office with the drive and told him to pretend he's doing routine logs. I'm calling Coast Guard Investigative Service and State Police Internal Affairs, but I need time." Jack glanced back toward Rachel's curtained bay. "Time is what Mark doesn't give," he said. Sarah's voice hardened. "I know," she replied. "He was supposed to be one of ours." That sentence, supposed to be carried grief like a bruise. Then Sarah regained steel. "Where are you?" Jack gave the clinic name. Sarah said, "Stay there. Keep her protected. If anyone asks, you're a civilian rescuer and she's an unidentified hypothermia patient." No names. Jack understood. "What about the shipment?" he asked. Sarah's pause was almost imperceptible. "We saw movement at Pier 9, she said. "Reefer truck, gate override. If Rachel's right, it's leaving before dawn." Jack's heart kicked hard. He looked down at the memory card. "Rachel said they hide people in freezer cargo," he said. "If that truck goes, then people go," Sarah finished, voice tight. "And if we move wrong, we lose the case and the people." Jack felt a bitter laugh rise and die. That was always the trap. Save the evidence or save the living. Rachel had tried to do both. It had almost killed her. Jack lowered his voice because his next words felt like stepping onto thin ice. "Sarah," he said, "I can track a truck. I know the back roads, the service docks, the private ramps. I've worked salvage along this coast for years, and I'm not on their radar." Sarah was silent long enough that Jack imagined her staring at a map, hair iron gray, face set like a weathered cliff. He pictured her the way Rachel had described her without meaning to: short hair, wind-browned skin, posture like a lighthouse that refused to bow. Sarah spoke at last. "And you have a dog?" she said. Jack glanced at Bishop, who watched him from the doorway as if he'd been listening to every word. "Yeah," Jack replied, "and he's got a nose that doesn't lie." Sarah exhaled. "This is not a movie," she warned. Jack's mouth tightened. "No," he agreed. "Movies end clean." Sarah's voice dropped, firm as a gavel. "If you do anything, you document. You do not engage. You do not become the story." Jack stared at the clinic hallway, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. He thought of the man he'd lost in that Carolina dive, the seconds that had made him who he was. He felt something settle in his chest, heavy, right. "I can do that," he said. Sarah hesitated, then gave him a name, a Coast Guard investigator she trusted, plus a code phrase to use if someone tried to intercept the call. "And Jack," she added, voice softer now, almost human. "Thank you." Jack didn't know how to accept that. He swallowed it like medicine. He returned to Rachel's bay. She watched his face and read it the way she read crime scenes. "The truck," she whispered. Jack nodded. Sarah confirmed. "It's moving." Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for his wrist, a gesture that looked weak but carried a command. "Jack," she said, and her voice sharpened despite exhaustion. "They use freezer holds. People don't have long. If that shipment leaves, it's not evidence anymore. It's a coffin with wheels." Jack felt the words hit like salt in an open wound. He looked at Bishop, who stepped closer, placing his head against Rachel's leg gently, as if offering an oath in fur and heartbeat. Jack's mind tried to retreat back to quiet, back to solitary work, back to pretending this wasn't his problem. But the ocean had already made it his problem the moment it put Rachel's face behind that fogged glass. "I'm not letting them vanish," Jack said quietly. Rachel's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with fierce gratitude that almost looked like anger. "You don't even know me," she whispered. Jack's mouth twisted into a humorless smile. "The sea tried to take you," he said. "That makes you my business." He tucked the memory card into the inner pocket of his coat, pressing it against his chest where it would feel his heartbeat, proof that it was still on land, still alive. Then he leaned close to Rachel, lowering his voice as if speaking to something sacred. "You rest," he told her. "You live. I'll carry the ugly part for a while." Rachel's eyes held his. "Mark will come," she warned again. Jack nodded. "Then he'll learn I don't disappear easy." Bishop's tail thumped once, a quiet punctuation. Jack stepped out into the hallway and felt the cold world waiting beyond the clinic doors, full of white noise and dark water and a refrigerated truck preparing to roll toward dawn. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd been handed a choice and finally stopped lying to himself about which one he would take. In the parking lot, the snow had begun to fall in wider flakes, softer, almost gentle, an innocent disguise. Jack pulled his hood up, clipped Bishop's leash, and walked toward his skiff, with the memory card pressed to his chest like a vow. The ocean had written its threats in salt and ice. Jack answered in the only ink he trusted, motion. The sea kept changing masks, but the face beneath was always the same, cold, patient, and hungry for secrets. Hours after the clinic, after warmed blankets and stern instructions and a nurse who looked like she could scold a hurricane into behaving, Rachel Bennett insisted on standing up. Her legs trembled, her wrists throbbed where plastic had bitten deep, and her ribs complained every time she drew breath, but her eyes were awake in a way pain couldn't dim. She wore borrowed Coast-issue thermals under a thick jacket Jack had dug from his skiff locker, the sleeves slightly long, the shoulders built for a larger body, making her look like a determined kid wrapped in a grown-up's armor. A medic tried to stop her with a gentle hand and a sharper voice. Rachel answered with a stare that had ended arguments in alleys and dockside bars. "You can't go back out," Maya Ortiz warned from the doorway, braid tucked tight, fatigue turning her concern into sarcasm. "That's not bravery. That's frostbite with the side of paperwork." Rachel's mouth twitched. "I'm not going back out," she rasped. "I'm going to make sure people don't vanish." Bishop stood between them like a vote that had already been cast. The German shepherd's coat had dried into rough waves, and he watched Rachel as if she were the only lighthouse left on the coast. When Jack clipped the leash, Bishop leaned forward eagerly, then gave Jack a look that said, in fluent dog, "Hurry up, human. The sea doesn't wait for speeches." Jack didn't argue with the dog. He rarely won those debates. They moved quietly, not like heroes marching, but like people who'd learned the hard way that loudness attracted the wrong kinds of attention. Sarah Monroe had done the smart thing, and the bitter thing. She didn't come in person. She sent instructions through a secure channel, a calm female voice that sounded like it had sand in its throat from years of salt wind and swallowed anger. She also sent a name, Lieutenant Nora Keene of Coast Guard Investigative Service, someone who didn't worship local politics and didn't owe favors to men with clean badges and dirty hands. Jack had Nora on his satellite phone under a code phrase that felt ridiculous until you remembered ridiculous things kept people alive. The plan, if it could be called that without insulting the chaos of reality, was simple. Find the movement, document it, and keep breathing long enough for the right uniforms to arrive. Rachel carried the partial memory card in a sealed sleeve on a cord around her neck, under her thermal shirt, because she'd learned evidence belonged close to a heartbeat. She also carried Jack's compact camera, a rugged little device with a stabilizer and a bright recording light she'd taped over. A tiny blind eye was still an eye. "If we do this," Jack told her as they approached the harbor again, "you stay behind me." Rachel snorted softly. "That's adorable," she said, then winced at her own ribs because humor was brave until pain reminded you it was expensive. Jack exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and surrender. "Behind me," he repeated, "or at least behind something that can stop a bullet." Bishop's ears perked at the word bullet, not because he understood the syllables, but because he understood the tone. The old world of work had returned. The harbor looked different at pre-dawn. Storm clouds still hung low, but the wind had shifted, giving the sea a brief, grudging lull. Snow fell in thicker flakes now, softer, as if the storm had gotten tired of being dramatic. The docks were quiet, too quiet for a working coast. A few sodium lamps burned like sick moons, and beyond the channel markers, something large sat in the dark water with its lights dimmed, an absence shaped like a ship. Jack lifted binoculars. The vessel was a processing trawler once, broad-beamed, squat, with crane arms and a low superstructure, but it had been altered the way predators evolved: insulated panels, extra refrigeration exhausts, unusual venting. The name on the stern, barely visible under a dusting of ice, read Silver Tide. It hovered outside the usual traffic lane, anchored off-channel like it was ashamed of its own reflection. "That's not where a ship sits if it has nothing to hide," Jack murmured. Rachel raised the camera and began filming, hands steady despite tremors. She panned slowly, catching the ship's position relative to markers, the dimmed deck lights, the faint glow of a reefer unit venting white breath into the dark like a dragon trying to look innocent. Bishop's nose lifted, his body stiffened. The dog's throat produced a low growl that sounded less like anger and more like recognition. He wasn't seeing a boat. He was smelling a story: diesel, fish rot, human sweat sealed under cold, and something sharper: fear, old and recent, layered like stains you couldn't scrub out. Jack's jaw tightened. "We're not boarding," he said, mostly to himself. He had lived long enough to know how quickly just a look became a funeral. Rachel didn't answer with words. She kept filming, and her eyes hardened into the kind of focus that belonged to oath-takers. Jack thumbed his satellite phone, shielded the screen from wind, and used Sarah's backup channel code. "Keen," a woman's voice answered after one ring. Crisp, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't ask permission from chaos. Lieutenant Nora Keene sounded mid-30s, but her tone had the wear of someone who'd spent years listening to lies and learning which ones were lazy. "This is Jack Mercer," Jack said, "per Harbor Master Monroe's instructions. I've got Officer Rachel Bennett with me. We have visual on a vessel Silver Tide anchored off-channel, lights dimmed, refrigeration running. We have documentation and a partial memory card linking an internal suspect." There was a beat of silence, then Keene spoke like a knife sliding from a sheath. "Do not approach," she ordered. "Transmit coordinates." Jack did, and Rachel kept filming. "We have reason to believe human cargo," Jack added, and hated how clinical it sounded. Keene didn't flinch. "Units are inbound," she said. "Maintain distance. If you lose sight, do not chase into open water." Jack almost laughed. The sea had never cared what you wanted. "Copy," he said anyway. Rachel lowered the camera a fraction, listening. "How long?" she whispered. Jack shook his head. "Long enough for trouble to notice us," he said. Trouble noticed fast. A small launch detached from the Silver Tide's shadow and moved toward the inner harbor, cutting the water in a purposeful line. Its running lights were muted, its engine kept low, someone trying to be invisible while still moving with confidence. Jack watched its approach, muscles tightening. Rachel raised the camera again. Bishop's growl deepened. The launch slipped near a service dock and stopped. A figure stepped onto the planks with the posture of someone who believed the night belonged to him. Even at distance, even through snow, Rachel recognized the way he moved, measured, unhurried, rehearsed. Detective Mark Halston climbed onto the dock like a man stepping onto a stage, and under the nearest lamp his face was briefly revealed. Square jaw, close-cropped dark hair dusted with snow, stubble along the chin, eyes flat as iced glass. He carried a pistol low at his side as if it were just another tool, like a flashlight or a radio, and he wore that thin, practiced smile polite enough to pass in daylight, sharp enough to cut in dark. Rachel's breath hitched. Jack saw her shoulders tense and understood instantly. This wasn't just the machine. This was a cog with a human face. Mark scanned the dock, then the shoreline. His gaze moved with the certainty of someone who expected to be unchallenged. Then his eyes stopped, locking on the shape of Jack's skiff tucked behind a stack of crab pots and a tarp-covered winch. It wasn't visible to most people, but Mark wasn't most people. He'd been trained to see what others missed, and tonight he'd chosen to use that gift like a weapon. "Well?" Mark's voice carried over the water, not loud, just confident, like he didn't believe in fear anymore. "The ocean spits you back out." "That's inconvenient." Rachel's hand tightened on the camera grip. Jack's mouth went dry. He moved slightly, placing himself between Mark and Rachel without making a show of it. Bishop's body went taut, paws planted, tail low, eyes fixed on Mark's weapon hand with the clarity of instinct. Mark stepped closer along the dock edge, boots crunching. "You should have stayed cold, Rachel," he called, using her name like he owned it. "You made this messy." Rachel's voice came out rough but steady. "You made it murder," she shot back. Mark laughed softly, a sound with no warmth. "Murder is loud," he said. This was weather. He lifted the pistol slightly, not fully aiming yet, more like reminding them what kind of conversation he preferred. Jack's pulse hammered, but his mind stayed clean. Distance, cover, angles. He remembered Keene's order, "Do not approach." But Mark had approached them. The sea had brought the fight to shore, like a myth that didn't care which chapter you were ready for. Jack raised his hands a fraction, palms open, and spoke like a man negotiating with a storm. "You don't want this," Jack said, buying seconds. "Coast Guard is coming." Mark's smile sharpened. "Then you really don't want this," he replied. "Because if they arrive and find you here, you become part of the narrative. And I'm very good at narratives." Rachel's eyes flashed. "The only narrative you're good at is lying," she snapped, then coughed as pain caught her ribs. Mark's gaze flicked to her weakness, calculating. He started forward. Jack moved first, not as an attack, but as a collision. He stepped out from cover, closing the gap with the speed of someone who'd spent years diving through cold water toward sinking things. He didn't reach for Mark's gun. He reached for Mark's balance, slamming a shoulder into Mark's chest and driving him back toward the dock rail. Mark swore, recovering fast, pistol rising. Rachel's camera kept rolling, capturing the ugly truth the storm tried to blur. "Jack!" Rachel shouted, and in the same motion she drew the compact pistol Sarah had insisted she carry. Small, light, meant for last resorts, not hero fantasies. She didn't aim to kill, she aimed to change geometry. She fired a warning shot into the dock planks near Mark's boots. The crack tore the quiet open like paper. Splinters jumped. Mark flinched back a half step just enough. Bishop exploded forward. The German shepherd launched himself at Mark's weapon arm with a force that looked almost mythic, like a living anchor thrown from the deep. His jaws clamped onto Mark's forearm, not tearing wildly, but locking, braced, dragging Mark's aim down. Mark grunted, staggering, trying to wrench free. His pistol discharged once into the air, the shot lost in the storm like a cruel laugh. Bishop did not release. His body shook with effort, paws scrabbling on slick boards, eyes burning with purpose. And yes, he shot Jack a look between motions that said, with ridiculous clarity, "See? This is why you keep me around." Mark swung his free hand, striking Bishop's shoulder with something hard, maybe the pistol butt, maybe a knife hilt. Bishop yelped once, a sound more offended than broken, and still he did not let go. A second shot cracked, lower this time, and Jack saw it. A grazing hit along Bishop's shoulder, blood dark against black fur. The dog's body jolted, then steadied, stubborn as winter. Jack's stomach turned to fire. He drove his forearm into Mark's throat, pinning him against the rail just long enough to force the pistol away from any clean line of sight. Mark's breath came hard, eyes furious now, the polite mask shattered. "You think you're a hero?" Mark hissed. Jack's voice came out low and deadly calm. "No," he said, "I think you're done." Sirens rose in the distance then, first faint, then real, the sound of authority rushing toward the dock like a tide that finally remembered it had teeth. Red and blue lights flashed through the snowfall from the road above, and out on the water a Coast Guard cutter's horn bellowed, deep and undeniable. Lieutenant Nora Keene appeared with agents and armed responders, moving fast, controlled and very unimpressed by the universe's excuses. Mark froze as if the air itself had turned into ice around him. Bishop finally released, dropping back a step, chest heaving, blood trickling from the grazed shoulder. Jack caught the dog by the harness handle, steadying him. Rachel kept filming until Keene's voice cut through everything. "Weapon down! Hands where I can see them!" Mark's pistol skittered across the dock as someone kicked it away. Cuffs clicked shut around Mark's wrists, the sound crisp and final, a tiny metal prayer answered. Keene's eyes flicked to Rachel's bruised face, then to Bishop's wound, then to Jack's salt-stiff coat. She didn't smile. She didn't praise. She simply nodded once, the way professionals acknowledge survival without romanticizing it. "You documented?" she asked. Rachel lifted the camera with a shaky hand. "Everything," she whispered. Keene looked at Bishop. The dog's amber eyes met hers with blunt defiance, as if daring anyone to call him just a dog. Keene exhaled. "Get that canine to a vet, now," she ordered. Rachel's gaze snapped to Bishop, panic blooming. Jack tightened his grip on the harness. "He's still standing," Jack said, voice thick. Bishop's tail thumped once stubborn, offended, alive. The silver tide sat out there in the gray water, lights dim, refrigeration humming, pretending it was only a ship. But now it had been seen. And the story had changed. It was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about who still breathed and who would, because someone finally refused to look away. Dawn came in like an apology the world didn't deserve. The snow eased from a punishment into a hush, and the harbor so loud with wind and sirens hours before held its breath beneath a pale, cold sky. Floodlights from Coast Guard vehicles painted the pier in harsh white, turning everything honest. The salt crust on ropes, the ice glittering on cleats, the red smears where Bishop's shoulder had bled onto the boards like a signature. The vessel, Silver Tide, sat just beyond the channel markers, no longer a shadow, pretending to be ordinary. Now it was surrounded by cutters and rigid hull boats, its dim lights glaring as if embarrassed to be seen. Jack Mercer stood near the edge of the pier with one hand wrapped around Bishop's harness handle, the other clenched tight enough to ache. The German shepherd's breathing was steady but heavy, each exhale fogging the air. A bandage had been wrapped around his shoulder quickly, the white already freckled with dark blood. His ears stayed forward anyway, stubborn as a legend, and his amber eyes tracked every armed figure moving toward the ship. He was hurt, yes, but not diminished. If anything, he looked offended by mortality. Rachel Bennett stood beside Jack, swaddled in a borrowed jacket that was still too big for her, bruises showing under the harsh light like purple fingerprints of betrayal. Her hands shook from cold and aftershock, but her posture was straight, spine locked in the way cops learn to stand when the world wanted them folded. Lieutenant Nora Keene approached them, moving with brisk purpose. She was taller than Rachel, lean and sharp, hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her cap, face pale from winter and long nights. Her eyes were a clear gray blue that didn't soften for sentiment, but they didn't need to. There was respect in their directness. Keene spoke without wasting breath. "Your footage?" Rachel lifted the camera with a careful hand. Keene took it like it weighed more than plastic. "Good," she said, then looked at Jack. "And the memory card you mentioned." Jack tapped the inner pocket of his coat where the small sealed sleeve pressed against his chest. "Here," he said, and handed it over. Keene slid it into an evidence bag with gloved precision, then nodded toward the ship. "We're boarding," she said. "If you want to watch, do it from here. Do not step onto that vessel." Jack's jaw tightened. "Understood," he said. Rachel's eyes didn't leave the Silver Tide. The boarding team moved like a practiced tied-to rigid-hull boats, cutting through ice-choked water, agents climbing the ship's ladder with weapons lowered but ready, bodies angled for cover. The Silver Tide's deck was slick with frost. Cranes and winches loomed like skeletal arms. The ship smelled of fish processing brine and rot and chemicals, but beneath it the wind carried another odor, faint and wrong. Human sweat sealed under cold, like fear marinated in metal. Jack saw Bishop's nostrils flare. The dog growled low, not at any one person, but at the concept of what lay inside. On deck, Mark Halston was already in cuffs, head bowed slightly as if he were listening to a private sermon no one else could hear. The cuffs were real, now steel, official, undeniable. Not the zip ties he had used, like disposable cruelty. Mark's face was cut and pale, his thin smile gone. He looked older without his mask, like a man who had relied on control the way others relied on warmth. A Coast Guard agent guided him down the gangway. Mark's eyes lifted once, finding Rachel. There was no apology in them now, only calculation trying to survive its own collapse. Rachel met his stare with something new. No naivete, no pleading, no shock. Just a steady, level truth. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Silence, used correctly, could be a verdict. Jack watched Mark pass, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not triumph, not relief. More like a knot being untied after years you forgot it was there. The sea hadn't delivered justice. People had. The world, messy and human, had chosen to. Out on the Silver Tide, a heavy hatch was opened near the midship structure. Cold vapor poured out in a thick plume, curling into the air like a ghost leaving a coffin. The refrigeration unit's hum turned from background noise into a threat you could hear with your teeth. Two agents braced themselves, then hauled the hatch wider. The light from their headlamps cut into the dark interior, and for a heartbeat, nothing moved, just stacked crates, plastic-wrapped pallets, sterile labels that tried to pretend they were only seafood. Then a sound rose, soft, human, broken into the shape of a whimper. Rachel's breath caught. Jack's hand tightened on Bishop's harness. Keene's voice barked orders, sharp and immediate. "Medical team up! Warm blankets! Get them out slow!" The first person to emerge was a woman mid-20s maybe, thin as a reed, hair matted under a knit cap that didn't belong to her. Her eyes were huge, unfocused, the gaze of someone who had been taught that looking at people only brought pain. She stumbled onto the deck, and an agent caught her gently, guiding her into a thermal blanket that swallowed her like mercy. Behind her came another, an older man with a gray beard, stiff with ice crystals, lips trembling, hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold the railing. Then another, and another, some limping, some carried, some walking with the stunned obedience of survivors who hadn't yet accepted they were allowed to exist in daylight again. Their faces looked like winter itself had tried to erase them, and failed. The pier went quiet in a way that felt sacred. Even the wind seemed to pause to listen. Rachel's eyes filled, but she didn't let tears fall. Not yet. She watched as medics' new figures rushing enwrapped bodies in heat, checked pulses, moved with the careful urgency of people who knew the first danger after rescue was shock. One of the medics was a man in his 40s with a shaved head and a blunt face, the kind of face that didn't promise comfort but delivered competence. His jacket read, "Paramedic Sam Doyle." He moved like a bulldozer with a conscience, pushing through crowding officers, snapping instructions, forcing warm packs into hands that were too numb to accept them. Another medic was a younger woman with freckles and a red ponytail escaping her cap, eyes bright and fierce Lena Park, who spoke softly to survivors as she worked, like kindness was another tool in her kit. Jack didn't notice those details by accident. He noticed because his brain still lived in rescue mode, cataloging the people who mattered, the ones you trusted when time ran out. Bishop watched the survivors too. His ears softened slightly, his growl fading into a quiet, steady whine. He tried to step forward, to go to them, to offer warmth and presence. His injured shoulder protested. He paused, stubborn, then glanced back at Jack as if asking permission to be heroic again. Jack knelt, putting a gloved hand on Bishop's neck. "Easy," he murmured. "You did your part, warrior." Bishop's tail thumped once, grudging, like a soldier forced into retirement for 5 minutes. Rachel finally exhaled, long and shaking, and something inside her loosened. She turned to Jack, voice low. "If you hadn't—" Jack cut her off with a small shake of his head. "If Bishop hadn't," he corrected, because Jack was allergic to praise. Bishop huffed, clearly pleased by the accurate attribution. Lieutenant Keene returned with another woman at her side, Harbor Master Sarah Monroe. Sarah looked exactly like the kind of person who could hold a coastline together through pure will. She was in her late 40s, medium height, broad-shouldered beneath her heavy coat, with iron-gray hair cut short and practical, skin weathered by salt wind. Her face had strong lines around the mouth and eyes, the lines of a woman who had learned to swallow fear and spit it back out as orders. Her eyes were a deep brown, steady and unromantic, but when she saw Rachel, something flickered. Relief, anger, love disguised as professionalism. Sarah stepped close, and Rachel's guard faltered just enough to look young again. Sarah didn't hug her at first. She held Rachel's shoulders firmly, as if checking she was real. "You're going to file the report," Sarah said, voice rough. Rachel blinked. "Yes," she whispered. Sarah nodded once. "Good. And then you're going to rest, because if you die after surviving this, I'll haunt you myself." Rachel's laugh broke out, small and cracked, and it turned into a breath that sounded like a sob she refused to let win. Humor was the only way grief could enter without tearing the roof off. Sarah's gaze shifted to Jack. "Mercer," she said, not unkind. "They'll offer you something." Jack knew what she meant. A handshake, a plaque, a news camera hungry for a clean story. Jack looked away toward the water, toward the Silvertide's hull, now ringed with official boats like sharks that had remembered what they were. "Tell them no," he said quietly. "I don't need a medal for doing what I should have done years ago." The words slipped out before he could sand them down. Rachel looked at him sharply. "Years ago?" Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't answer with details. He didn't have to. Some losses lived in the shape of a man's silence. Sarah seemed to understand without being told. She didn't push. Instead, she nodded toward Bishop. "Your dog needs care," she said. Jack glanced down. Bishop's bandage was darkening. The shepherd's eyes were still alert, but his breathing had deepened. He was running on adrenaline and loyalty, the two fuels that always ran out when you least wanted them to. "We have a vet on call," Sarah added. "Nora Finch. She's good." As if summoned by her name, a veterinary tech van rolled in, and a woman stepped out. Nora Finch, early 30s, compact, hair tucked under a cap, movements controlled and gentle. Her eyes were tired but warm, and her hands were the kind that made animals stop trembling. She knelt beside Bishop, speaking softly, examining the wound without wasting time. Bishop held still, pretending he wasn't impressed, but his tail thumped once anyway. "It's a graze," Nora said after a quick check, voice firm. "Painful, but not catastrophic. He'll need stitches and antibiotics. He'll be angry about the cone." Bishop's ears flicked as if he understood the insult. Jack exhaled a breath he'd been holding since the dock fight. Nora looked up at Jack. "He'll be okay," she repeated, because humans often needed the reassurance more than dogs did. Jack swallowed hard, then nodded. He rested his palm on Bishop's head, feeling the warmth beneath fur, the living proof that the night hadn't taken everything. "Good," Jack murmured. "Good boy." Bishop leaned into his hand like a tired ship leaning into harbor. As the sun rose higher, the harbor changed. Yellow tape went up. Cameras arrived at a distance. Survivors were loaded into ambulances, wrapped in blankets like newborns delivered from a metal womb. Mark Halston was led to a vehicle, head down, his story now owned by evidence and law, not by his careful lies. Rachel stood with Sarah and Keene, giving a statement, voice steady, eyes clear. She wasn't the same Rachel who had driven alone with an evidence pouch and a hope that systems would protect her. She was harder now, yes, but not broken. She looked like someone who had learned the shape of the abyss and decided to keep walking anyway. Jack sat on the edge of the pier after it all, boots dangling above black water, shoulders hunched against the cold. Bishop lay beside him on a blanket, bandaged, eyes half closed but still tracking Jack's face, because loyalty didn't sleep deeply. Jack pressed his hand to the dog's neck and whispered, barely audible over the gulls and engines, "It's okay. We're back." The winter remained. The sea remained. It didn't turn kind because humans did one brave thing, but something else had changed, something mythic in its simplicity. The truth had been pushed under, and it had risen anyway, carried up not by thunder or angels, but by a man who refused to look away and a dog who refused to let go. In the end, the sea did not turn gentle. It simply stopped pretending it could swallow everything forever. The silver tide was only metal and locks and cold air, yet even that kind of darkness learned a hard lesson. When truth is chained, it still finds a way to breathe. And if there was a miracle that night, it wasn't thunder splitting the sky or angels stepping onto the pier. It was smaller, quieter, more like the way God works when the world is too loud to hear Him. A woman who refused to look away, a man who chose to turn back into the storm, a loyal dog who held on when fear shouted, "Let go." In that stubborn trio, grace moved, steady as a heartbeat, warm as a hand on your shoulder, persistent as morning. Because that's how faith often arrives in everyday life. Not as a perfect rescue, not as a life without pain, but as strength that shows up exactly when it's needed. As the courage to make one more call, to tell the truth one more time, to help a stranger even when it costs you, to keep breathing when the cold voice in your mind whispers, "Just sleep." So if you're watching this from a kitchen table with a cup of coffee or from a quiet room where the day feels heavy, remember this: God has not forgotten you. Storms can be loud, but they are not the final voice. And even when the world looks away, heaven doesn't. Sometimes God sends help with boots and blankets. Sometimes with a phone call at the right second. Sometimes with a dog's bark that refuses to fade. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in miracles, type Amen. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances, because you never know whose night you might brighten just by showing up. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and guide you safely through every storm you face. May He place the right people beside you when you feel alone, and may His light find you even in the darkest waters. Amen.